On June the 5th, 1967, the Middle East erupted into what became known as the Six-Day War. Ordered to within earshot of the battle zone was the USS Liberty, a signals intelligence collection ship. On June the 8th, the Liberty was patrolling 22 kilometers off the Sinai coast, though in international waters, its close proximity to the Arab-Israeli conflict made it a vulnerable target. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Israeli planes mounted an attack. As the Liberty was engulfed by fire, Israeli torpedo boats joined the attack. Incredibly, the pummeled Liberty did not sink, but 34 died and 170 were wounded. The next day, as the crippled vessel limped towards Malta, Israel offered apologies. Its military leaders claimed it had mistaken the American vessel for an Egyptian transport, the El Khazir. Some historical analysis has suggested otherwise. It's been pointed out that on the day of the attack, Israel had almost completed its overwhelming victory over its Arab enemies. But Israel's primary objective, the Golan Heights, was still held by the Syrians. By attacking the Liberty, the Israelis may have been trying to prevent America from learning the full extent of its gains. Concealing this information would have been crucial in staving off American intervention to stop the war before the Golan could be won. Whatever the truth, the fate of the Liberty is poignant evidence of cryptology's inherent peril.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the boss.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
We can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 025, Remember the Liberty. Our featured guest in the Midnight Hour is Philip F. Nelson, author of Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas. And Phil will join us next. First, however, a little cleaning of the castle. Our Facebook page is at Midnight Rider News Show. That's Midnight Rider News Show. Our Twitter is MWN_ST Patrick. That's MWN_ST Patrick. Our email, midnightridernews@gmail.com. midnightridernews@gmail.com. The free archives of the show can be downloaded or listened to at Midnight Writer News, and that's writer, W-R-I-T-E-R, as in someone who writes. Now, I want to thank various members of some new outlets for the show. I want to thank the readers of the American Free Press, as well as the podcasts and podcasts we listen to Facebook groups. To all of you, a special hello. Now, I hope you enjoy this as much as we enjoy bringing this to you. And we'll be right back with Philip Nelson, the author of Remember the Liberty. It was a day which will live in infamy. But what do we really know about Pearl Harbor? In episode 007, we talked to Doug Horn to find out what FDR really knew and when, what documented evidence we have of FDR's foreknowledge, and what it all meant for the future of World War II.
Hi, this is Douglas Horn, author of Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. If you want to know the truth about FDR, Japan, and the real path to Pearl Harbor, listen to Episode 7 of the Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick.
The author, Philip F. Nelson, grew up in Indiana and studied at the University of Wisconsin. He served in the Peace Corps in Brazil, and he began researching the JFK assassination intensely in 2003. He published his first book, LBJ, The Mastermind of the JFK Assassination, in 2010, and he followed that with LBJ, From Mastermind to the Colossus, in 2014. Phil can be found at lbjmastermind.com. Now, important to us, he's also the author of the new Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas. So let's welcome to the show. Phil, how are you doing this evening?
Very well, thank you. And you?
I am well. So let's jump right into this incredible story of the attack on the USS Liberty. Now, it's only been in the last, say, 8 to 10 years or so that I've heard about the Liberty, and it's near sinking. So when did you first hear about it, and how did you become interested in it?
Well, I heard about it, I guess it was about 10 years ago, when I read a book by James Bamford called Body of Secrets, An Anatomy of the Ultra-Secret National Security Agency. Anyway, that book was published, it had been published several years before that. It was published, I think it was 2001. I never read it until, 5 or 6 years later. And that's when I first was exposed to it. I didn't remember anything about it when it happened, and the reason was that hardly anybody did. It was broadcast on the news networks, and it was in some newspapers, but only briefly for a day or two, and then it sort of went away, and it was almost like, well, it was not a major news event after all, and if I heard it then, I was in college at the time, and I used to watch the news, Walter Cronkite and all that. But I just don't remember it. And the reason was, well, it was all about the cover-up that was invoked immediately, basically by Lyndon Johnson through the chain of command, through Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then through them to Admiral John McCain. At that time, he was the commander of it was the Atlantic Fleet at that point. He was the commander of the Atlantic Fleet, and so all of the admirals below him answered to him. And, in the military protocols, orders are orders, and people followed them, and were taught not to ask too many questions, about the implications, the morality, and there wasn't time for that, and they were trained, as military men are, to follow orders, and that's what happened. And the order was that they were going to put a seal on that entire story, and all of the men on the Liberty were told personally by a rear admiral named Isaac Kidd Jr. that they could not tell anybody, not their family, not their wives, not their mothers or fathers or anyone else. And in fact, they were ordered not to even discuss it amongst themselves, sailor to sailor. And it was that, and it extended beyond the Liberty, though. All of the men on the ships that finally came to the rescue 18 hours later to assist, in removing the dead and wounded and to try to patch up the ship and so forth to get it underway again. They were all given the same orders, that they could not discuss that with anyone, and if they did, they risked prison, quote, or worse, whatever that meant. Well, that's the reason that the news was sealed up, and not very many people even heard about it at the time, and it took many years. As a matter of fact, it took about 12 years before even the first books were written on it. And even at that time, the earliest book that was written was by a fellow named Anthony Pearson, and he was British, and he had gotten some information about the attack through his own sources, and
he sort of hid those sources with false names and so forth because he didn't want to get them in trouble for the same reasons. But anyway, he was in some ways he was very bold for even getting near the story. In other ways, a lot of men on the Liberty, or some of the men, I wouldn't say a lot, but certain of them were very critical of him because some of what he stated, not just in the book in 1978, but in 1976, there were a couple of stories in Penthouse magazine. That's the only magazine that would even carry these stories. You didn't see anything about it in the more popular magazines like at the time Newsweek and Time and Life and all that. So the message got out very slowly, and finally in 1980, Jim Ennis, who was a lieutenant commander officer on the Liberty, did write the first book in the U.S., Assault on the Liberty, and he basically told the story as he knew it. And then other books followed, and in a piecemeal fashion over decades later, additional pieces sort of came out one at a time in some of these books, but none of those books really got to the essence of the story that I think that we've covered in, through the help of three of the men on the Liberty who assisted me, and telling their own stories. And then everything I'd learned over the years in my research on Lyndon Johnson also entered the picture, and we were able to write a more thorough and comprehensive account, including some background about LBJ's previous treasons, and that's how we got to where we are.
So, when news of the Liberty attack began to leak both in America and around the world, how did the American and Israeli media first spin the story?
Well, in the immediate aftermath, there was something called a court of inquiry that was conducted, and the problem was though that it was not given anywhere near the amount of time it needed to pursue this and actually flesh out factual truths. In fact, that was never the objective. The objective that had come down from Johnson through McNamara and John McCain II, the father of our current senator from Arizona, it came through that military protocol, and the orders were given that they had exactly 7 days. They had 1 week to get the story down, and they wanted a particular story to be written, and it had nothing to do with all the facts. It was more a contrived story which justified it, and this story was written in conjunction with the Israeli, the military, I guess the IDF is what it's called, and so that they would be in sync. That is, the Israel side was that, well, this was just a horrible accident. It was unintentional, and they stated that they thought it was an Egyptian ship, Egyptian warship, when in fact the ship that they referenced was an old horse carrier. It was an antique. It was not even seaworthy. It was, and they must have known this. They must have known where every Egyptian ship was, and if they would have checked their charts or their records, they would have found that it was moored in a harbor somewhere on the coast of Egypt. Egypt at the time was called the United Arab Republic because they were in a combine with Syria and Jordan, and the three of them were in this mutual organization. Well, anyway, they put together this contrived story together, and so it was an agreement that was done rapidly because no one really thought the ship would be around. The plan was to have it sink, but it didn't sink. And so as a result of that, they had to work very fast and furiously to hammer together the story, and that's what they came up with. That's what they tried to sell to the public, except that even that was not widely disseminated. And in fact, the lies were told from the beginning. That, in other words, they knew that there might have been a few days where they didn't know precisely how many men were killed, but they knew it was at least 25, and they knew that there were missing men down in that compartment that had been flooded by the torpedo that did hit. And so they must have known it was closer to 30 or 35. Well, it turns out there were 34 who were killed immediately, and there were over 170 who were injured. And yet, in the book, I have a copy of a newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, I think it was, which stated only 4 were killed and 50 injured. And everyone, who had anything to do with it knew that was untrue. But that was what was told to the public when it first occurred. And they were trying to minimize it, of course, and to make it such a, it was an accident. It was a non-event. Let's, nothing to see here, folks. Move on. That was the nature of it, and it was so thorough that even 4 years later, when Johnson wrote, Doris Kearns actually wrote as a ghostwriter Johnson's memoirs, and in that book, it was stated that there were only 10 men killed and 100 injured. This is 4 years after the fact. I mean, they had to. I mean, that was so ridiculously off the mark but you have to understand that Johnson, and we've seen this repeated over and over by the people who worked with him, who knew him best. He felt that, basically, he couldn't tell the difference sometimes between truth and lies. And so that's what he believed, and he felt, and many of his aides, verified this. This is not something I'm just making up. He felt that whatever he stated was the truth, and everyone else had to agree with whatever that was. That was just the way he was, and so that's how he had the audacity to understate so significantly those numbers 4 years later.
Now, that may be surprising to those who see Johnson as the purveyor of the supposed Great Society, but we're going to discuss the details of LBJ's knowledge later in the show. For now, let's set the stage in the United States and in Israel at this time in the world. Under whose leadership and under what conditions does this attack take place?
Well, that's it's quite a question. I'm going to have to put my thoughts together to answer that. But so if we start about who was in charge? Obviously, Lyndon Johnson was the president of the United States, and I just mentioned some of the people who were under him. But there were others who were White House advisors. There was Walter Rostow, for example, and there was George Bundy, and Bundy had a brother, and Rostow had a brother. One was in the Eugene Rostow was in the State Department, and anyway, they were basically they and a few other people, as the chair, that is the director of the CIA, Richard Helms, and a few others less notable. So I'm not going to name all the names, but there was something in an organization that was then called the 303 Committee. And that committee met right across the street from the White House in the Executive Office Building in room 303, and that's why it was called the 303 Committee. But it was a very elaborate office that was basically the office of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and that was Earl Wheeler. So the counterparts that in Israel, I guess you would start with, I think his name was Levi Eshkol, was the prime minister. Moshe Dayan had just been made the head of the Israeli IDF. In fact, that was on June the 1st, and when the attack came on just days later on June the 5th, he was the guy who was directing the IDF. They had planned what would become the 6-day war, though, almost from the start. When Johnson became president in 1963 on the death of John F. Kennedy, he told Golda Meir at the time, that Kennedy's funeral, that is, that they had lost a great friend, but they found a better one. And he also said, with me in the White House, there will be no repeat of the Eisenhower incident of 1956. Johnson, and the reason he said that is because he was really burned by what happened back in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, because he tried to intervene with Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, and really tried to countermand Eisenhower, and in order to get him to back off of the sanctions against Israel, because they were holding on to territory in the Sinai Peninsula that they had won during the skirmishes there over this battle, related to the Suez Canal. Nasser had nationalized the dam, the Aswan Dam, as a result of what happened there, however, and that had turned it into an even greater crisis in 1957. But because what Eisenhower did was he made Johnson back down, because he insisted to David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, that they release those lands. That they were not going to occupy that territory. And basically, ultimately, he won. Johnson lost. Johnson was still burned up about that 10 years later. So all this time, he was trying to help Israel in every way possible, even back that early and earlier. I think he was involved in a lot of other things even before that, but that's sufficient to make the point.
Okay, so let's go through the story itself for those who may be unfamiliar. What was the purpose of having the Liberty off the Israeli coast, and what happens on the day of the attack?
Okay, there were actually two intertwined operations going on, and they started 2 to 3 years in advance of June of 1967. In fact, by 1966, there were already operations going on in Israel, as I've described in the book in detail. That is, we had American military advisors over there training Israeli officers, in order to prepare for this war. No one knew at that time who was involved in this. That they didn't know the dates or the details or just what it was about, but they knew enough as to what was necessary to train Israeli officers. So that was going on in 1966, and there are citations in the book about that. The plan, though, got to be at some point, and this was documented as well in the book, through a leak that was found by that Jim Ennis I mentioned earlier. And after he had written his book, some years later, I think it was about 1988, but I'm not sure exactly when he did this, but he was in the LBJ library looking through all the records related to the USS Liberty. And he came across a document in there which turned out to be the minutes of a meeting of that 303 committee from April, I think it was the 12th of 1967, nearly 2 months before all of this action. Okay. And he saw in there, within those minutes, references to Operation, the Frontlet 615. Okay, that was the code name that they had been using for the 6-day war. And so everybody who was involved knew that meant, yeah, this is the war that we're going to help Israel launch through providing them all kinds of military equipment and advice, and even letting them use some of our airplanes as well. It was the reason for that frontlet 6/15. That 6/15 meant June the 15th. That was the date it was supposed to start. Okay. However, now before I go on with that, though, Operation Cyanide was a subpart of that, and that was the plan that to have Israel attack the Liberty with unmarked fighter jets, so that the attack could be blamed on Egypt, and that false flag would then be used by Johnson to enter the war on Israel's side to retaliate against his sworn enemy, President Gamal Nasser, I mentioned just earlier, a few minutes ago. There's something I want to interject here, and that is that in spite of all the secrecy and the sworn oaths to not say anything, a lot of people had started talking in the aftermath, and finally even books, as I said before, had been written about it, and things sort of got off the rails with regard to the massive cover-up. And Captain McGonigal, sometime I believe it was just before he died. I think he died in 1998, and I think some of the information I'm about to impart only came to him a year or two before that. And it was through associates of his, high-level friends in the Pentagon, who basically finally told him that something that he would then repeat to Lieutenant Commander George Golden 30 years later. Now, I'm talking about 1998. In other words, just before McGonigal died, he had told George Golden a key secret that had been kept secret all that time. What he said was, quote, we were sent there from Africa to make this happen. What he meant was they had been down off the Ivory Coast of Africa, down around the Horn, and that was 6,000 miles away, and they had just gotten there, and the ship was being serviced, and all the sailors were out and about, and they were just on R&R, and suddenly they got the message that they had to get on the ship and get it underway and make best speed to Rota, Spain. And that's what happened. It was an immediate thing, and they were used to rather routine sails, and sometimes even to the state of almost being boring, I guess. I'm just getting that from what they've all written or said about it. But this was different. Now they were somewhat frightened about it because they didn't know what they were going to be getting into. So they were given. Well, they only had 2 weeks to make the entire trip. The first week was from the Ivory Coast to Rota, Spain, and that was to take on supplies and also more linguists who were familiar with Hebrew and Arab languages. So they got there, and on May the 31st, and on June 2nd, they were off again making top speed, which was only about 18 knots. And so they were told to get themselves in position right off the Sinai Peninsula and to start monitoring communications. It was a spy ship. They were monitoring communications. So that was June the 2nd. By June the 5th, as I mentioned earlier, the planning for the war sort of got out of hand because of the provocations that Israel was making against Egypt and Syria as well, and Jordan, but especially Egypt. And so on June the 5th, well, the Liberty was sailing, south of Italy. It still had 4 days to go before it even got there. It never arrived until the morning, or late in the day, late in the evening of June the 7th, so that on the morning they were finally in position, and now they were going to take up this slow sail along the coast of Egypt. Okay, at this point, the war was 4 days. It was already almost over as respects Egypt, because Egypt had been attacked by surprise by Israel on the very first day, and within the first hour or two, their entire air force was destroyed. At least 300 of their airplanes were, and they may have had a handful that somehow escaped that, but for all intents and purposes, they had no air force anymore. And the same was true of the Navy. They didn't have much of a Navy to begin with, and whatever they had was destroyed. Okay, and that made the plan really untenable. Okay, the fact that Israel went ahead and started this 10 days early is something, I think it's one of the greatest mysteries of all. What was the real reason for that? But anyway, it is what it is, or was what it was. So I just told you what Captain McGonigal finally leaked out to this other fellow who was a high-level officer on board the Liberty, George Golden, 30 years after the fact. Okay, 10 years before that, another admiral, Louis Geese of the USS America, had revealed to Lieutenant Commander David Lewis that President Johnson had ordered 2 sorties of fighter jets recalled. They had been sent to defend the Liberty. One immediately, within 10 minutes after the attack, these fighter jets were on their way. And there was also a couple of A4s with nuclear bombs on them on the way to Cairo, I should add. Okay, all of these aircraft were launched off the USS America very quickly after the attack was found out. Now, the fact that they found out, that was a miracle right there, because during the attack, the Israeli fighter jets suddenly appeared out of nowhere and leveled off in attack formation. 3 French-built jets. I'm trying to remember the names of them. They weren't Mystirs. Yes, I'm sorry, they were Mystirs. They started firing at the Liberty with cannons, with heat-seeking missiles. The works. They were just attacking everything on the ship, and they had other airplanes map it out during the morning hours. Up to 12 or 13 flights had overflown the Liberty, and they just circled it, and they were waving back and forth. Everybody thought they're friendlies, and so not too many questions were raised. But now it appears clear that what they were doing were they were mapping the ship, and they were identifying exactly where the attack needed to be focused. They only had 4 guns. They were 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the aft and 2 in the forward sections of the ship. And of course they were targeted first, but there were also 45 antennae of all kinds of descriptions. And those antennae, that was the whole communication ability of the ship. And the idea was they had to get those in the first couple of passes too, in order to avoid it sending out an SOS. And so what happened was they took out every one of the antenna that was then active. That was 44 of them. But there was another one that was not active. And as a result of that, it was still functional. Okay, and they didn't realize that. Israel did not realize that they were able, by stringing in a new coax cable out to it from the transmitters below, that they could get a message out, and that's exactly what they did. It was a heroic effort on the part of the crew to accomplish that. But but they did. In the middle of being fired at, this fellow went out and strung that cable, and they were able to pound out a SOS message, and the Sixth Fleet heard about it, and so that was what caused them to launch that first sortie of aircraft. Well, after that, only minutes after they were launched, Robert McNamara got on the horn with Admiral Geese and told him to recall those aircraft. That we're not going to war over a few dead soldiers, is what he said. And so he said, but if you hold off 90 minutes, you can launch another set of jets, a sortie of jets to go defend it then. In other words, that they were giving them 90 minutes to go ahead and finish the job, and the expectation was, of course, that within that time, the Liberty would have sunk, and it wouldn't be anything for them to look at anyway. Well, so they waited that way, and then 90 minutes later, they launched another sortie, and this time it was Admiral Geese was assuming that the reason they were recalled the first time was that it included a couple of those jets with nuclear bombs on them, and so he set it up. He rigged it up so the airplanes it would have been impossible for them to be carrying nuclear arms, and so there would be no question about that. And so when it came time, they were sent off, and as soon as the word got flashed back to D.C., McNamara comes back on the line and orders Geese to recall those airplanes as well, because they knew that the ship has still not sunk. Well, Geese demanded, he demanded to have some confirmation from his superior, i.e., President Johnson. President Johnson was standing right there. He got on the line and ordered them to recall the wings. He said, he didn't care if the ship sunk and took all the men to the bottom. He would not embarrass his ally, Israel. Okay, those stories finally came out. The first one, this one, what Admiral Geese told David Lewis. He had told Lewis that just immediately after the attack back in 1967. But he told Lewis that he had to promise not to ever say anything about it until he, that is Geese, died. Well, he died in 1987. And so then David Lewis told this story to his fellow survivors, and it became known to them. Here was 20 years after the event. And the other story, the one from Captain McGonigal to George Golden, that was still another 10 years down the road. So my point is that, it took this long, it's 30 years altogether, for those facts to come out. And they came out after some of the primary books were written. So that information is not in those earlier books. So that's one of the reasons I decided, it's about time that somebody writes a book that's more complete, has all of that in there, and some other information too that we'll get to shortly. But I think I've said enough for now on that topic.
That is an amazing yet tragic story. Now, for those who need it clarified, I'm going to make it simple. The Israelis attacked a United States ship during a war. Not only did we not hear about it, but Israel suffered no repercussions for the attack. And so I have to ask the obvious question, Phil. Why?
Well, from the Israeli perspective, they had, for decades, they wanted to strengthen the country of Israel by expanding the borders a bit and to weaken their enemies. They had these kinds of objectives, and that was what provoked their interest. Now, from the standpoint of Johnson, and the fact that, we've proven here that the planning was a mutual deal that was going on, and we've said that it had been going on for a couple of years, as early as 1965, I believe, shortly after Johnson was finally elected to the presidency on his own, so to speak, in a huge landslide that, by the way, was directly the result, or partly the result at least, of another false flag operation that, even though it failed, it worked. In other words, the Gulf of Tonkin, is what I'm referring to, really never occurred. We all know that now. But at the time, it was said with such urgency by Johnson that, and I believe he knew all along it was bogus. But he wanted, for his own purposes, to conduct a war that JFK had tried to avoid. JFK had tried all along. Well, I shouldn't put it quite that way. He went along with some of his advisors, Rostow and the others, for the first couple of years, and that, by that I mean he agreed to increase the number of advisors sent there, and even the scope of their function. But he was resisting sending combat troops to Vietnam, and slowly he evolved so that by the early part of 1963, he was committed to ending involvement in Vietnam, and there were a number of instances which that would take an hour or so to go through all that, but there's plenty out there that has been written. I recommend the book by John Newman, JFK in Vietnam, for starters. But there's, it's clear now. I think anybody who's studied it at all will understand and agree to the premises that I'm laying out here, that the JFK had turned around and he was making definite efforts to end our involvement and to bring those existing troops that were over there, not troops, but the advisors, back home. After he was reelected in 1964, then by the end of 1965, they would all be back, to the U.S. And that it was as simple as that, But as soon as Johnson took over, all of that turned around 180 degrees. Even though he was saying that he was going to follow, JFK's programs and policies, well, that was that was the furthest thing from his mind. He, in many ways, he turned it all around, and even mouthed those words as he tried to get his legislation through, to do it for JFK, in memory of JFK, over and over again. For all of us who were old enough to have been there and have heard that, it's something you don't forget. Well, anyway, here we are with Vietnam. So he within just a few weeks after becoming president, he charged McGeorge Bundy with developing a plan. It got to be called Plan 34A. That would be a series of provocations to North Vietnam that would, he was hoping, cause them to attack one of our ships. Now, if you can imagine this, we're talking about little old North Vietnamese gunboats attacking U.S. destroyers. It's so far-fetched that it's idiotic. But anyway, that was the plan, and by August, the 1st of August of 1964, which was, by the way, exactly 3 months before the presidential elections. That has a lot to do with the timing of this whole deal, this charade. And I don't want to get too far off the track on that point, but it was a successful false flag action, even though there was no attack to begin with. That's a huge irony there, but that's what it was. Okay, so here we are, 3 years after that, and they had been working on this plan for most of that 3-year period, and it was coming together in the early part of 1967, and we have the evidence, right, that Jim Ennis himself found in the LBJ library, a copy of a memo that was misfiled. I should have mentioned that earlier. It wasn't something that was ever intended to be in that file. It was clearly, a mistake that somebody made. And he found out that himself later when he tried to to get additional records from the 303 committee about this operation, Frontlet 615 operation, or the Operation Cyanide. Okay, that was also mentioned. Well, there was no other records available because they weren't they were not furnishing them. That was part of the cover-up. You see, it had to all be hidden, and it was only by the stroke of this misfiling, some clerk misfiled it or something, whatever, that we even know that. But that is definite proof of what I just said, that it confirmed that all the planning was right next door to the White House. It was going on in room 303 by this committee, a committee that has been variously called, under Nixon it was called the 40 Committee or something, and it was under Kennedy it had been called the Special Group, and then it was called the Special Group Augmented when Bobby Kennedy took charge of it. It's basically now called it's part of the National Security Council. Okay, but at this point, you have to understand that Johnson was a very domineering fellow, and it was his way or the highway. He didn't want anybody who would disagree with anything that he stated, and they all understood that from day one. In fact, the day after JFK was murdered in Dallas, he came back and on his very first cabinet meeting, the next day, he made it clear that we're going to have no more divisions about this Vietnam stuff. You know, we're in it to win, and you know, I don't have all the quotes right here, but that's essentially the message. From day one, we're not going to have any disagreements on this. You either go along with me or hit the road. And that's basically the way he ran everything. And Robert McNamara, it took him a long time. See, Robert McNamara, you have to understand that he was all caught up in the whirl of Camelot and all that. He had his picture, and I remember seeing his picture on Time and Newsweek and Life and, you know, U.S. News and World Report. Every time you turned around, here was his picture again. And that sort of, salves one's ego and makes the ego expand and so forth. And he really thought that, well, the only way I'm going to really make it around here is to go along with him. And that's the way, and in fact, he even said that. I quote him at length in the book about that very point, that he didn't think a functioning democracy could exist unless everybody agreed with the president and did what he wanted to do. That was his policy, and he was just chagrined with anybody who didn't understand that. George Ball was one of them, and they went down. A special meeting just between them was conducted for 2 or 3 weeks in a row on a Saturday, where they talked all that through. And they were at odds with each other on that very point. And George Ball was one who always voiced his opinion and would debate anything that he thought was incorrect. Well, of course, he didn't last too long, so much for that.
So, Phil, I'm a little confused regarding Israeli motivation. Now, this is the 4th day of what would be a 6-day war, and the Israelis, for all intents and purposes, had already won the war. So, it seems as if they didn't really need the U.S. to enter the 6-day war any more than, say, the U.S. needed anyone to help them go into Panama. So, what was their real motivation?
Well, you put your finger right on the magic button, I think, because that's the thing that had always bothered me about all of the premises. There are so many people who believe that it was all on Israel, and poor LBJ, he just sort of got tagged in the wrong place, the wrong time deal, and he was very unfortunate to have to stumble into this mess. Well, that ignores the fact that he had his committee working on this in conjunction with the Israeli leadership, for 2.5 years. And the specific document that I'm referring to proves that. So it's not something I'm just dreaming up. Well, you have to ask yourself at this point, what was Johnson's real motive here? Was it just as a result of his hatred of President Nasser of Egypt, and he's trying to get even with him or something like that. That might have been part of it, but I think his real objective, you have to understand, and this we've taken some length to make this point in the book, and so what I'm about to say is unless you read the book, you're not going to really understand Johnson's motivations here. But you have to consider where Vietnam was in the scheme of things in 1967 when this happened. Okay, and the Vietnam War was a disaster, and there were protesters right across the street in Lafayette Park, many of whom, by the way, were Jewish, and there were a lot of New Yorkers there, Jerry Rubin and so forth, and Abby Hoffman and so on. They were over there chanting every single day, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Over and over, and again, I'm not making this up. I'm citing references to people who were there, and they have acknowledged that, in fact, he was very bugged by that. And it was very upsetting to him and his family. Lucy and Linda Bird and all those could see it on his face that he was very tormented. Yeah, and they come forward now and say, yeah, he was just agonizing over the Vietnam thing. Yeah, he was agonizing, all right. He was counting, when he wasn't counting his money that he was making as a result of his investments that were made specifically because he knew which companies would be making the most out of this deal. And I've backed that up in the book as well. But anyway, be that as it may, that was part of it. But what it was the result of that, his decreasing popularity at home. After all, consider that just a couple of years before, in 1964, he had this massive landslide in the election that, and he had a lot of capital built up in that. He knew that he could spend it freely, but he was spending it too freely. He was doing a lot of stupid things with regard to the war, and it had upset a lot of people, probably the majority of Americans by this point anyway. And he knew that he was going to have an uphill run. And it was really proven out in the ultimately, when this plan failed, the Liberty did not sink, and therefore he didn't have what he thought would be this rush of patriotic support that would come along with that, especially again in New York and Miami and L.A. For the people who felt deeply about Israel. That he felt would turn them around and make them, passionately supportive of him instead of detractors from his policies. So his concern all along, really, it was always about getting reelected. And he thought he was going to be in trouble if he didn't do something really dramatic. Well, what it was having his ship sunk so that he could declare war against Egypt on the side of Israel and join them in that battle and the fight and the war. And it sounds bizarre. Of course it does. Be a fool not to recognize that. But you have to put yourself in the mind of a fellow who was not exactly a rational man. And that is a point I've hit very hard in the book. Not just once, not twice, maybe 3 or 4 times from different angles in different chapters of the book. And he had a record of psychotic episodes. And this is not something, again, not something I'm just dreaming up. This comes from serious sources like Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, like Richard Goodwin, ironically the husband of Doris Kearns eventually. But he wrote a very compelling book in 1988 called Remembering America. And he had a whole chapter, I think it was chapter 26 or something. And I think it was like 40 pages, something like that. It was a big chapter. And it was all about some of these episodes where he, and speaking on behalf of Bill Moyers, I mean, he was telling the world what really went on in the Johnson White House, and he gave many references to what Bill Moyers had told him directly. Now, you won't hear Bill Moyers ever speak of that, of course, but it's indirectly coming from Moyers through the pages that Richard Goodwin wrote that spoke of multiple episodes of psychotic behavior, of meltdowns. And there were other books written by people who were there. A Marine general named Charles Cooper wrote something. It was a devastating account of how Johnson had a complete meltdown in a meeting with the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff and their substaff in November of 1965. And they were all shaken to the bone. I mean, they came out of there white and pale, pale and completely, psyched out of what they just witnessed the President of the United States dead. So I'm not going to spend, a lot of time trying to go over all that, but it's all in the book. And by the way, the question you asked, I want to elaborate on that just a minute here, because you're pointing out, yes, this was the fourth day of a 6-day war, and it was over. Egypt had already not only lost, they were in New York at the UN negotiating a ceasefire and a peace treaty. So why hell would anybody think that they were going to, that there was no way that Israel could seriously pin the blame on Egypt, which had been the plan all along. Now, had it happened on the first day, they could have done that. But this is the fourth day. And Johnson still had not come to his senses enough to understand that. He was so obsessed with this operation. He wanted to get on with it, and nothing was going to stop him. Well, except the fact that the Liberty did not sink, thanks to the heroic crew. It did not sink. And believe me, that was just you'd have to read the book from what these fellows that helped me, that were co-authors of that book, with whom, by the way, I'm sharing the proceeds of the royalties with as a donation to the Liberty Veterans Association.
Very nice.
Which I recommend to anyone who wants to either find out more or to help them overcome the obstacles that have been put in their way for 50 years now. It's you can't make it up how absurd this story is.
Seems like a very worthy cause. Thank you for doing that. Now, I want to get back to the Israeli motivation again. Now, are we saying that the Israelis took part in the operation at this point simply because they wanted to please their sort of big Texan brother, so to speak? Or is there another motivation that caused them to move forward with the attack and then the cover-up?
Well, there are some things, there were some anomalies I wanted to mention that make no sense other than there being indications that Israel was trying to stop Johnson, that they were trying to slow him down and to make him realize that they couldn't get by with this anymore. There was no way that they could blame Egypt anymore for this attack. Egypt had no airplanes. How are they going to blame Egypt? But Johnson thought, oh, we'll just patch it up and make it work, and it'll be fine. He wanted it so desperately, as a feather in his cap when he ran for re-election, that nothing, no rational explanation could possibly change his mind. Now, let me just enumerate those. We mentioned one before. Why did Israel really start the war 10 days early? Against the warnings supposedly from Johnson not to do that, or not to even go to war. A lot of people are saying, well, Johnson was warning Israel not even to go to war, period. Well, he wasn't. He was simply trying to have them delay it until the June 15th. That was the plan all along. But things got out of hand. Whatever happened, but we really seriously do not know yet what was the real reason they slipped the date by 10 days. That's just unbelievable, especially when you consider that date was so important. The whole operation was named around that date, 6/15. It was frontlet 6/15. It was supposed to be June 15th. Okay, that's one thing. Another one is that during the attack, Israel shot 4 torpedoes at the ship and all missed. How do you explain that? Okay, what they say is, well, they were just crummy French torpedoes that weren't built very well. Well, that's debatable, but you have to consider that, if there was any doubt that they were going to miss, all they had to do was move in closer. There was nothing to stop them from getting closer. There were no guns on the Liberty. They were completely defenseless. There was nothing, zero, nada, there to stop them from getting as close as they could or should to guarantee that all 4 of those torpedoes would hit the ship and it would sink within a minute. Okay, that nothing that I can possibly think of can make any sense of that. So all I can say is, well, maybe they intentionally missed them, knowing that they had no believable reason, no rational, logical explanation for blaming Egypt anymore. So how are they going to get by with that? Okay, so that's point number 2. The question about why did Johnson commit the known treasons? I mean, everybody by now I think understands that everybody's actually studied it with an honest, an open mind. That he recalled 2 sorties of fighter jets sent out to protect that ship. He was the president of the United States, and he called them all back. And it was it's something that defies explanation. So all of those reasons that we've just talked about tell me that there was something else going on here. And I'm not, believe me, I am not trying to take the focus off of Israel entirely. Obviously, it was a heinous thing that they did. It was a horrible, mindless thing that they did to even agree to participate in that operation in the first place. But the fact of the matter is, there were several indications that they were trying to resist it. It was Johnson who was pushing it all along.
Not to be argumentative, but while you do write about what seemed to be blatantly missed torpedoes, you also very fairly write about the deliberate destruction of the Liberty's lifeboats by the Israelis as well. Now, if the Israelis were sort of sparing the Liberty, even to a small degree, through some level of, say, purposeful ineptitude, why would they then destroy the lifeboats?
Well, yes, they did. There's no question about that. The torpedo boats came in with their machine guns, and when they started launching the lifeboats, which were whatever they're called, inflatable, and they shot out all of the lifeboats except for one, which, according to witnesses on the Liberty, that one, they decided to save that one for like a souvenir or whatever. But there was no way for the survivors, the men on the ship, to get off the ship, and save their lives if the ship were to sink. And that the idea all along, previous to all this, the idea was to sink the ship and take every single one of the sailors and other civilians and 2 or 3 Marines on there, take them all down to the bottom of the Mediterranean. That was the idea. And if they had done that, then on the first day of the war, then they could have probably blamed it on Egypt, and it would have been a successful false flag operation. Johnson would have, got his re-election deal and all. Of course, it might have caused a major conflagration with Russia or the Soviet Union at that time. But there was nothing that was going to stop him. I think his resolve is proven by everything he did to ensure that it would happen. And the one thing that I didn't mention before, I said we would get back to, and this has to do with a video. Anybody can Google this. Just Google USS Liberty, Larry Weaver, okay, and hear him explain this for yourselves if you don't want to believe me. And that is that the word that he got from an investigator that he had to hire in order to prove that he was even on the ship. He was so injured that he almost died. And if it hadn't been for another sailor who came up to him and helped him hold his intestines inside of his abdomen and get him down to the medics, if it hadn't been for that, he would have been dead right there. But for whatever reason, and this is one of the very strange things that happened as a result of this cover-up, and they went to great lengths to cover this up. And in his case, they tried to deny that he was even on the Liberty. And so his records were fudged to indicate that he was on the Sixth Fleet, but on the America. Okay? And he had to hire an investigator who had high-level connections in the Pentagon to prove that he was on that ship and that he was probably the most seriously wounded guy on there who actually was able to survive, even though it took him 34 operations over many decades to get himself repaired and so forth. But you can hear him speak for himself. Just Google that information and it's right there. He in this YouTube video has stated that investigator came back to him with the information that it was Lyndon Johnson who had gotten so desperately anxious, and another one of those psychotic meltdowns that I mentioned before. I mean, you can see it happening if you've read the material that I've furnished in the book. It was just another psychotic reaction. That's all. And he so desperate to salvage this operation was he that he ordered his own submarine, the USS Amberjack, to fire a torpedo at his own spy ship, the USS Liberty. And that was done, and the men who did it, have a couple of them have admitted this privately to him, but he had promised not to release their names until they chose to do so, and they have not chosen to do so. So what we have is, it's a story that it is what it is. You can believe it or disbelieve it. It's up to you, the listener, whoever. You can check it out for yourself. I happen to believe him because it fits with everything else I've stated about Johnson, and it was almost expected to me, even though it's so bizarre, so upsetting. You can understand why these other sailors have not agreed to allow this to be, their names to be published.
Now, this is your third work on the Johnson years, so it's pretty safe to say that you're an expert on Lyndon Johnson by this point.
Well,
so I'd like to know, from all the research that you've done, years of research that is, what's the one thing you learned about LBJ as both a man and a leader?
Okay, well, my take on Johnson, of course, is not quite like what you might get from other authors. Robert Caro or Robert Dallek, for example, or especially Doris Kearns. Doris Kearns Goodwin. No, it's not that at all. In fact, I think it's a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde deal. Okay, they've described the Dr. Jekyll, and I'm describing the Mr. Hyde, I guess it would be. And he was. I don't know what I guess when I was about 18 years old is when I started having my doubts about this fellow's character traits. Okay, when I was 18 years old, actually maybe more. No, excuse me, more like 17 or something. Anyway, whatever. It was when I was very young. I was still in high school, and across the PA system, there came this announcement that and this was on a Monday, by the way. But the announcement was saying that Friday, that is 3 days previous, there was an airplane crash on Lyndon Johnson's ranch. And don't worry, the vice president is fine. He was on the ground. He was waiting for the airplane to arrive. And that was just very mysterious to me. And it got more and more mysterious when then we find out later that, there was an ownership question. Who owned that really? And in a nutshell, that was never really adjudicated. There was an insurance claim check that was made payable to him that was never claimed. But there was a flurry of work in the intervening time during that weekend especially, and then for days afterwards, to document the ownership of the airplane. And then it came out slowly over time. This is the problem with all these stories, that they came out slowly over many times or many years later. But eventually it became known that the reason that airplane crashed on his ranch was because he ordered that airplane to come there and land on the landing strip that, by the way, the taxpayers paid for, this little landing, the runway. So because he had to attend the important work of the vice president, and he had to have access to his ranch, and so forth. So anyway, that's all in my first book, if anybody wants to read about that one. But the point I'm trying to get at is that when that accident happened, it was because he ordered the pilots to take off in that airplane. It was a Convair 440, and it was destined for his runway at his house, and they were to land that, and they better damn well land it, because he had to get up to Midland, okay, for a meeting. That's how much we know now that that's what happened. But the problem was that it was below minimums, and there were no instruments. So they couldn't do an instrument landing. He had no instruments down there to do that. It was just a runway, and everything was supposed to be VFR, visual flight rules. And so they tried to land it, but it was so foggy, it was like pea soup, and they couldn't tell where the runway was. But they were under orders that they damn well better land it. So they tried to land it, and in the process, they ran that airplane right into a grove of cedar trees on a hillside, and they were killed immediately. So all that comes out later. But that meeting that he was trying to get to, he was trying to get up to Midland to meet with Billy Solestis, one of his first big time partners, and the frauds and swindles that they had conducted. It was basically Johnson facilitating Billy Solestis through the high levels of government to get exceptions and waivers and so forth, so that he could do things which effectively, were swindling taxpayers out of millions of dollars, $35 million altogether, just in this couple of years. And they had a multiple set of swindles going on. It wasn't just one; it was a whole set, and that's all explained in my first book. But to answer your question, it was through that, just thinking about that one for a minute. But then, as we got into the Kennedy administration, there were just a series of things. And I remember when I graduated from high school, there were stories, and I would bet you every single newspaper in the United States, maybe not a few weeklies out in Timbuktu, but every serious newspaper in the United States between March and September of 1962. Okay, 3 to 9. That's 6 months, and I'll bet you virtually at least once a week, probably in many cases every single day of the week, the stories of Billy Solestis were just ubiquitous. Every time you turned around, there was another, and it was on television. And it was always related implicitly, not always stated as such, but it was always implicitly related to the fact that Billy Solestis was in league with Lyndon Johnson and these swindles. Now, go try to find a mention of Billy Solestis, given that background, 6 months of intense news coverage, because of these swindles. Try to find that name in any of the 4 books that Robert Caro has written. You're not going to find it. That's what you're going to find. And it wasn't just those stories. It was the stories that grew out of them too. Okay, and a lot of those stories had to do with men who were murdered in order to keep their mouths shut, and to be warnings for Billy Saul Estes never to talk about, never to himself ever talk about it, because he would join them, in that club. So there were. Billy Saul Estes himself would later state that there were 17 murders that Lyndon Johnson had commissioned. He had his own hitman to fly around the country on military aircraft to conduct these murders. And you're just not going to find that in his book, Robert Caro's book, or Robert Dalek's book, or any other book. And that's why I felt it necessary that somebody ought to be writing about some of this stuff to get it in the record, so that maybe a future generation will be able to learn from the mistakes of the past. Certainly our generation wasn't able to.
And this generation will, in part, because we've agreed to do 2 back-to-back episodes on your first 2 LBJ books. Now, those will air in January, and I can't tell you how excited I am to do those. So if you'd like to tell everyone about those 2 works so that they can prepare, please do so.
Okay. Well, the first one was published. I initially self-published it through Ex Libris, and those books are very hard to find. So don't worry about that. That was rewritten into a more concise volume called LBJ, the Mastermind of the JFK Assassination. And the editors took out a lot of material for the post-assassination treasons, things like Vietnam, for example, and an assortment of other things. And they told me, if you want to write about his period of the presidency, then do that in a separate book. I said, that's fine, we'll do that. And so we did that, and that book was called LBJ From Mastermind to the Colossus, also a Skyhorse book. That was published in 2014. Now, in addition to that, we've been talking about the book Remember the Liberty, which is a Trine Day book just published on June the 8th of this year. And that's what we've been discussing. There is one more book that will be coming in April. And the title of that book, this is also a Skyhorse book, is going to be Who Really Killed Martin Luther King. The subtitle is The Case Against Lyndon B. Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover.
And we look forward to having you on in April to discuss the new book.
Oh, yes. Yes. Be glad to.
When I was thinking about doing the show on your first 2 LBJ works, The Mastermind of the JFK Assassination and From Mastermind to the Colossus, I just couldn't think of any other way that seemed to fit other than to do back-to-back episodes, 1 on each work. And I think it's safe to say that we're going to present an LBJ to the listeners that they never heard about in their high school history textbooks.
Yes, I think we can guarantee that.
So I want to ask you about Senator John McCain. Now, you referenced his father earlier, so we know that his father, John McCain II, had intimate knowledge of the Liberty. Now, Senator McCain is, we are often told, a war hero and a supporter of the military. So, he must have come out in support of the Liberty veterans, right?
No, he has not. In fact, he's sided with what everyone who knows anything about it understands by now, that it was a charade, and it was a horrible charade. It was putting those poor guys many of whom already suffered from PTSD, giving steroids to PTSD because the brutal nature of this cover up, and the fact that they had to keep their mouths shut. They couldn't explain it even to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or their wife or anybody else. They had to suffer with the horrible memories that they had to deal with for the last 50 years. And some of them they're just, well, it's amazing they've been able to hold up as well as they have. But, it's a very sad thing, and I can't dwell on it much here because it's so upsetting to me, of course, that, well, it touches me emotionally, and I've had to learn to deal with some of this, in other ways. So, yeah, it's very tragic. But now, let's talk about John McCain a minute, because in addition to him not recognizing and not coming forward and trying to find real truths and so forth, what happened to him and his father in the immediate aftermath? I'm talking about, okay, this occurred in June, and by July, his father had been given a promotion by Johnson for his terrific work in covering this whole thing up. And so he was taken from being the commander of the Atlantic Fleet and put in charge of the Pacific Fleet. Okay, and that was a pay grade or two higher, I guess. But anyway, that's what happened. And just a few months after this, I can't remember exactly when that was, but it was I think it was in September or October of 1967. But you can find out. All you have to do is Google the USS Forrestal fire. Okay. Well, if you look at that deeply enough, you'll find that John McCain, according to some people who have come forward, really started that whole thing, because he did an operation. He was pissed. Can I say that word?
You may, yes.
At another pilot who happened to be in back of his airplane, and so he thought he would get even with the guy by using what they call a wet start of his jet. So they flush the engine with jet fuel and then hit the ignition, and when it starts, it shoots out a huge flame out the back. And he was trying to, scorch the airplane and the guy in back of him. He's a prankster. His whole thing is, and he crashed 4 or 5 airplanes for different reasons, but I'm not familiar with all of the details of all of them, but that's just absurd that, he's able to get by all of that, and in his hot dogging kind of fashion, and then after that incident there, this is not just a little thing where he might have burned or singed the airplane in the back of him. There were 134 airplanes destroyed in this humongous fire that resulted, and bombs were going off, and it was one of the biggest Navy disasters of all time on a U.S. aircraft carrier. And he was able to get off that ship immediately and go off with this R.W. Apple, who was a correspondent from the New York Times, and go in wherever they went. But he wound up getting his father. His father had him transferred to another aircraft carrier, and I can't remember the name right off the bat here. But he was moved away from that, so he didn't have to deal with the other airmen on board that the Forrestal, and that thing was just covered up. And it was lucky for him that his father was now in the Pacific to enable him to do that. But that's what happened, and I'm not making this up. You can check it out for yourself. There's all kinds of denials now, mind you. Not just him, but some of his buddies have tried to mount a massive denial of that. And I guess it works because, he's getting off as though none of that happened. And then he was called, when he was in the Hanoi Hilton, as they called it, he was given the nickname of the Songbird, because whatever they wanted to hear is what they got. So, I'm just paraphrasing other people who've written and or done videos about this, who were there, and they put forward a very compelling story about the real John McCain, both father and son.
Toward the end of your work, you write very pointedly about both Operation Mockingbird and Noam Chomsky. First of all, please tell us a little bit about Operation Mockingbird.
Well, Operation Mockingbird is something that Allen Dulles, right after they set up the CIA back in 1947, that was something that earlier versions of it had been there for some time, where they would try to find writers, syndicated columnists, authors, publishers, so forth, to carry the CIA message. And it started off, kind of small, and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally, by the early 50s, they had like 300 people signed on, as correspondents who would take whatever propaganda that the CIA wanted to put out and embellish it and put it in their columns, and put it out there as being honest to God, truthful stuff and whatever. Well, that grew over time, and certainly I think most objective and rational people realize that is still going on. Maybe a little more discreetly and subtly, and not anybody's they don't tag it with that moniker anymore, Operation Mockingbird. But that's how it started out, and it grew out of that, and that's what we're dealing with today with all the fake news that goes on. And much of it is, from people who are essentially mouthpieces for the CIA and other government agencies. Now it's probably much more widespread than it ever was back then. But it was always, as I said, I use that term propaganda. It's a word that my father taught me when I was about 12 years old. I didn't know what he was talking about, and he had mentioned it. And, it's just something an old faint memory. Probably the most valuable thing he ever told me. Anyway, so I'm not sure what else to say. I mean, there's so much that has evolved since then, and it's gotten more nefarious and sinister than it was even then. And the best example of it was the Warren Report, the Warren Commission that Johnson, set up, and they were charged. All those guys on there kind of knew that they had a directed verdict. It was going to be not an investigation whatsoever. It's going to be whatever the FBI told them. At least 99% of it came from the FBI without question. And even though some of the commissioners distrusted Hoover, well, it sort of didn't matter in the end. That was the result, and they were given a very short time to get to their conclusions and get them published. And it was all rush, and that's all it was. And it was just a series of myths that were planted about practically everything in there, and then just to paper the files to make it look like it was an enormously complex and effort. You'll find idiotic papers in there about Jack Ruby's mother's false teeth, and it's just it's mind blowing when you really get into it. But that's the historical fact. Yeah.
And what are your views on Noam Chomsky?
Chomsky, I think, is a latter-day, I guess you could say, a product of that Operation Mockingbird. He probably is the finest example of someone who has been planted out there to misdirect people and to do things like covering up real stories, real facts, and for him to deny that there were fundamental changes directly involving the conduct of the government as a result of the JFK assassination, for him to just be so blasé about it, and even admit that he's never really studied it in the process. Okay, he even admits that, which is, you can't make up how absurd that is. But that's the way it is. So, how are you ever going to question them about it? Now, I have done it, but I've seen many other people do the same thing, and we get nowhere. And I guess it's to be expected. But at some point, I believe what the Bard said, and I can't remember which play it was in, but eventually the truth will out. And I think that, I think that the truth about the USS Liberty, as close as we can get to it today, is told in our book, Remember the Liberty. And many people don't seem to get that, and many people want to continue putting all the blame on Israel, and they have, a thing about Israel that is almost, to me, it's just irrational. And so they refuse to look at the facts, okay? And what I've done is try to present the facts here. I'm quoting people like what Captain McGonigal told Lieutenant Commander George Golden, swore him to secrecy, and what Admiral Geese told Lieutenant Commander David Lewis, swore him to secrecy until he died, and in both cases. And so as a result of that, it came out, 20 years or 30 years after the fact, and it's been laying out there all this time, but no one's really tried to gather up all this and make a coherent, thorough accounting of what all of this, the direction all of this points to. And unless you do that, well, then we're going to be stumbling around for another 50 years.
Now, anytime an author criticizes Israel, there has to be some concern that there will be some sort of backlash from those who, for whatever reason, cannot differentiate between an anti-Zionist and an anti-Semite. So were you concerned about that backlash?
Well, yes, of course I was concerned about it, because I'm nowhere, there's not one scintilla of anti-Semitism in me, nor the other three authors who helped me on this book. And that's just an absurd assertion by people who have nothing better to come up with, because that sort of ends all the debate. That's the end of that. No more discussion. You're an anti-Semite, and it's reduced to this shouting match, and so forget about any kind of resolution. Although I can say categorically that is not the case, you're right. Any criticism of Israel begets that kind of conclusion. And there's a quote from Paul Krugman, himself at least a descendant of Jewish people, that even speaks to that. And he even gets accused of it. So, as long as I'm in such great company, I'm not saying he's great or anything. He's screwed up a lot of stuff, like, never mind. Let's not go there. But I'm in a very large company of people who have been, accused of something that does not exist because of people who have no better recourse or response. So no, I'm not too worried about it, to tell you the truth.
For those out there who would like to follow your work or contact you, how can they do so?
Okay, I have a website. It's called LBJ Mastermind, all together, no space, .com. So you can go there and you'll see a rundown of each of my 3 existing books on different tabs. And then there's a contact the author section as well. And there's a few other little pieces on there too that if you have interest in any of the 3 books, there are summaries of them stated there, and then there are links to purchasing the book at Amazon. And if you want to contact me about anything, that's fine too. The information is there in the contact the author tab.
And this has been Philip F. Nelson, the author of Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas. Now you can find him at lbjmastermind.com, and he'll be back on with us in January for 2 back-to-back episodes on his 2 LBJ books. So stay tuned for that. Hey Phil, thanks for being on with us tonight.
Okay. You're very welcome. I appreciate the opportunity. My pleasure.
And I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. the JFK assassination, Watergate, and the October surprise. Yes, even Pizzagate and the Trump administration. Author Donald Jeffries joined us on episode 004 of the Midnight Rider News Show to talk about his book, Hidden History.
Hi, this is author Donald Jeffries. When I want even more hidden history, I visit MidnightRiderNews.com and listen to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
So go to MidnightRiderNews.com and download episode 004 of the Midnight Rider News Show today. Philip Nelson's work is important. It shines a light on a telling event that has been lost or deliberately forgotten in our textbook history. Now, in my introduction to the show, I bemoan those textbook conglomerates that control information today, and I do so for good reason. As a former history teacher, I was often confronted with the issue of content bias. Now, on opening night, which is usually a parent night, I would entertain questions about my own perspective. Why was this or that book required reading? How will this issue or that event be taught? Now, the left-right paradigm and its multi-million-dollar talking heads have convinced the general public that the most major form of classroom content bias centers on whether a person, event, or concept will be taught from a conservative or a liberal point of view. The problem with that idea is that's not the most blatant form of content bias at all. Frankly, that's not even an issue for most educators. The most blatant form of content bias, in a history class especially, is the decision to include or exclude an event, a person, or a concept. That is the most important decision a history teacher makes about his or her content. Now, consider that most history teachers, sadly and unfortunately, use textbooks as the guide upon which they construct their outline and syllabus for the class. By drawing the outline from the textbook, the teacher is conceding the power of information to those textbook conglomerates, and that is how they control information today. Stories like the attack on the USS Liberty, which is also an illustrative event that can be tied to, for example, the Johnson years, foreign relations, the 6 Days War, Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin, Robert McNamara, John McCain Sr. and Jr., false flags, Operation Northwoods, Operation Mockingbird, and so on and so on and so on. Stories like those are teachable events. They are not isolated. Yet they are excluded by the textbook companies, and for obvious reasons. And when backpatting biographers also exclude them, then the American readership is also left in the dark. That's why authors like Philip Nelson are important, that's why the Liberty veterans who still tell their stories are vital, and that's why Midnight Rider News exists. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to S.T. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at MidnightRiderNews@gmail.com. And be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.